So you guys, today we're going to talk about asexual and sexual reproduction. So as we're talking about this, we've learned there's quite a bit of information that we're going to talk about. So I'm going to show you some note sheets as we go through that you can then access again later if you want to take notes for yourself. So what you need to know today is the difference between asexual and sexual reproduction. So we're going to look at those two things and then look at how the chromosomes. So remember that when we talked about chromosomes, so if you think about inside the cell, okay, there's the nucleus. And this is I'm going to do a really crude drawing here. And then inside the nucleus are the chromosomes. And so when we think about that, so if we look at this picture, you've got the cell, and then inside the cell is the nucleus, and inside the nucleus is the chromosomes. And remember that the chromosomes are our genetic information, or they contain the recipe or all the information needed to make a new cell. So for instance, your chromosomes contain all the information needed to make another one of you. And so when we talk about that, those chromosomes then are, one of the words that we use to talk about them are genes. So we're going to talk about chromosomes today, and that is talking about their genetic information and what all the information they have to make a new cell. And that's really important because it's different how it happens in asexual and sexual reproduction. So when we look at the difference, asexual reproduction is the formation of two new cells from the cells of a single parent. So we think about asexual reproduction, there's one parent, and that parent divides to form two new cells, and they are genetically identical, the two cells. So their chromosomes are identical. All that genetic information is identical to the parent, and then they're identical to each other also. So in asexual reproduction, all of the offspring are identical to each other. So when you take an antibiotic, so when you get sick and bacteria are dividing in your body, as they divide, that one bacteria divides to two that are genetically identical. Those two divide to four, they're genetically identical to each other. So that's why you can take one antibiotic and have it kill all of the bacteria that are living in your body because they're genetically identical to each other. Now that can happen really fast, like we've talked about before. So when you can go to school in the morning and feel fine, and by lunchtime you have to call mom or dad to come and get you and bring you home. So asexual reproduction, one parent divides to form two new offspring that are genetically identical to the parent and to each other. So here, we're going to talk about some different examples of asexual reproduction. So we're talking about binary fission, and then we're going to talk about budding, and then regeneration. And all of these, the reason they're asexual reproduction is they produce offspring that are genetically identical to the parent that they came from. So here's a picture, and I'm going to have to move my photo, it looks like. So cell division. Binary fission is basically just what we learned in the last unit as cell division in unicellular organisms. So it is the way that the word for reproduction. So here you have one cell right here that is copying itself. Sorry, I'm going to try to pick up. So one cell here that's copying itself. So that makes two nuclei. So it started with one, it copies the nuclei and makes another. Then the nuclei that are exactly the same move to the two sides of the cell. That cell starts to divide, and then eventually you get two cells that are identical to each other. So one cell copies itself and all of the information inside, and then makes two new cells that are identical. So that is just what we've talked about before, where cell division. So binary fission is the same as cell division in unicellular organisms, which results in reproduction. The next two are kind of bizarre. So it looks like I'm off the screen here. The next one is called, sorry, I'm going to get up there. Okay. So the next one is called budding, and budding is a really unique way that organisms reproduce. So if you look here, this is the adult or the parent offspring, and it is going to just start growing this bud off the side, and the bud is the new offspring, and it is exactly like the parent, it's just a new one. And so it is when it's fully developed or developed enough, it'll separate from the parent and it'll go on its way. The yeast here is doing the same thing. This is the parent yeast, and then this is the bud, and it's just growing off the parent. It's genetically identical to the parent, so it has all of the same chromosomes and all the same information, and it's going to then become an offspring. So then the parent and the offspring become two different. So if adults could, or if humans could bud, the funny thing would be that, so I'd be up here talking to you, and all of a sudden a little Mrs. Birkwood would start growing off my hip, and when it was fully developed into a full Mrs. Birkwood, it would drop off and run away. But humans can't do budding, but that's as close as I can do to explaining it to you. So if you think of it that way, as budding is growing a new human that is genetically identical. So it would be exactly like that. So the chromosomes are exactly the same. Okay. Then the next one is regeneration, and this is the one that is interesting to talk about, because regeneration, we all think of like when a lizard regrows a tail. Well, it happens and also to recreate a whole new organism in simple organisms. Remember, this can't happen in anything that's very complex. So here's one example. This organism right here is called a planaria. And it's a flatworm. It's found floating, it lives in streams and ponds. Sometimes it looks a little bit like a fluke. But what happens, let's say we take this one and it gets cut in half, or it breaks in half. Maybe an organism tries to take a bite of it, or in my science class growing up, we got one and we cut it in half with a razor blade. So then you'd have these two parts. What would happen is this head would grow a new tail, and the tail would grow a new head, and you'd end up with two new planaria. So in regeneration, an organism can regrow its body parts or even another whole organism that is identical to the original organism. Starfish do this too. So this starfish, if it were to be divided in half, whether an organism took a bite out of it or somebody cut it in half, this half that was cut off would grow a new half, and then this half that was cut would grow a new half. And it takes time. If you've ever seen a starfish or an organism that is missing part of, or has a smaller limb, that's what's going on. Interesting story, when starfish feed on clams and things like that people also like to eat. So people who hunted them, before they knew that starfish could regenerate, when they would find starfish in their nets, they would cut them to pieces and throw them back in the water. Well, as long as any part of this central disc is attached to the part that was cut off, they can regrow the whole thing. So by throwing the starfish back into the ocean, they were actually creating a new organism. So I'm just going to give you an idea. So planaria here are interesting. Here's a picture here. And the planaria, let's say that this one lost its head and body were separated. This is what would happen in about, we're following the growth of the bottom here. This is what would happen in about 14 days. You'd get this much growth, so you would have grown enough that there's a new head there. Now keep in mind that they're really small, super microscopic, because this is 1 centimeter. Now, interesting, this is what I got to do in my science class when I was in high school, is we were given a planaria, and we took ours and we took a razor blade and we cut right here, right between the eye. These are called eye spots. They don't actually see, they just sense light so that they can find food. So what do you think would happen if I cut right there? If you thought to yourself it would grow 2 heads, you were right. So what happened is, this isn't actually my planaria. I don't have pictures from that when I was 16, but the planaria would absolutely grow 2 heads. Now the problem with that is they can do 2 different things. So it didn't live very long because it couldn't get to food, because one of the heads would try to go one way and the other head would try to go to the other way. But that can happen. I just thought that's interesting. So again, there are 3 types of asexual reproduction. Okay? And asexual reproduction results in offspring that are genetically identical, so they have the exact same chromosomes as the parent as a parent and as each other. And the three types that we talked about again are binary fission, budding, and regeneration. So here's the notes that I would suggest if you're looking to take notes. This is what we've done before, and just thinking about what they are, and maybe drawing a picture or knowing. So that the other important thing here is that all of them are genetically identical to the parent that they came from. Okay. So then how does that differ from sexual reproduction? So also remember, in asexual reproduction, the offspring are genetically identical to the parent and to each other. So these two cells are genetically identical to each other, and they're related to this one. And then in this planaria, when we divide it in half, the two halves that are still present are genetically identical or have exactly the same chromosome information. In sexual reproduction, this is different. So in sexual reproduction, two parent cells or two cells combine their genetic information to form one new cell that is genetically unique or different from the parent. That should say from the parent. So in humans, that's the sperm and the egg come together. And this is how you can help yourself remember that they're genetically unique or different, is that you don't look exactly like either one of your parents. You have some traits from your mom and some traits from your dad because you inherited half of your genetic information from each parent. So in sexual reproduction, two cells come together, and it's usually the sperm and an egg come together to create one new cell, the fertilized egg, that is genetically unique or different. So here, when the sperm and egg comes together, it creates, let's just say it creates a human that then develop into a unique individual that is not exactly like either parent. Plants do the same thing, and you learned about that in the lab but you'll learn about that more in the lab tomorrow, But there's a male and a female part of a plant. So this is actually the male part of the plant. It releases the sperm, which is pollen. So many of you are actually allergic to the male portion of the plant. And then up here, this is the female portion of the plant that will collect the sperm. Notice how the sperm is lower. That's because we don't want to self-pollinate usually, so this sperm will get carried by the wind to another plant. Once the sperm or the pollen lands here, it will travel down this tube into the ovary of the plant and fertilize the egg that's there. So these would be genetically unique. Again, here's two birds. They're a male and a female, and they're going to get their sex cells together to take two parents that combine their genetic information to make one offspring. Okay. Now there's two types of cell division that are happening in sexual reproduction. The first is called mitosis. And mitosis, we talked about a little bit when we talked about cell division, that it's a type of cell division, and it occurs in your body cells. So, for example, skin cells, muscle cells, nerve cells, any of the cells that you have in your body that are not sex cells. So the process occurs when body cells divide to make two new cells. So this is the process that's causing growth, development, and repair. So when cells divide to make more of the same type of cells, each of the cells will contain a full number of chromosomes, and that's important. So in humans, when you have a full set of chromosomes, you have 46 chromosomes. You get 23 from mom and 23 from dad. They come together to give you 46 chromosomes, or a full set. So when you have these cells dividing, they're replicating all 46 of those chromosomes and then dividing them into the two new cells. So mitosis is the process that creates body cells, and that's what you need to know from that, and that it has a full set of chromosomes, or a complete number of chromosomes. Okay. Meiosis is the process that creates sex cells, and we have to make these differently because if you were to inherit a full set of chromosomes, then every generation organisms would have more chromosomes than the one before. So if you got 46 from mom and 46 from dad, you'd have 96 chromosomes. And then in the next generation, you get 96 and 96, which I think is 288. And then the next generation, they would do, and it just doesn't work. So every time when you make your sex cells, you go through one more cell division so that you have half the number of chromosomes per cell. So this just makes your sperm and your egg cells. So if you're a female, they make egg cells. If you're a male, it makes sperm cells. And they always have half the genetic information. So when the sperm and egg come together, the sperm brings 23 chromosomes, the egg brings 23 chromosomes for humans, and the resulting fertilized egg has a full set of 46 chromosomes. Now, sometimes it doesn't work right, and sometimes we get organisms that have more or less than that, and that's due to other things, and we will talk about that, I promise. We'll talk about that when we talk about diseases and when we talk about this a little bit more. Okay. So mitosis makes body cells, and they have a full set of chromosomes. Meiosis makes sex cells, and they have a half set of chromosomes. So here's an example. And in this case, remember that offspring that are created through sexual reproduction are unique. So they do not look or are not identical to each parent because they get some chromosomes from mom and some chromosomes from dad. So you get 23 of your chromosomes from mom and the egg. You get 23 of your chromosomes in the sperm from dad. And when you are fertilized, when there's a fertilized egg called a zygote, you have 46 chromosomes in 23 pairs, and then that develops into the embryo and the baby. So here again, the egg is the female sex cell and the sperm is the male sex cell. And when they come together in fertilization, so when the egg and the sperm join together, the embryo is formed. That's the baby, and that forms during fertilization. So here again, we have mitosis, which creates body cells, which gives you 46 chromosomes in each one of those. And meiosis creates sex cells, just the egg and the sperm, which is 23 chromosomes for humans. Okay, so here again is the notes that you might want to look at and take. So this is what we would have written down had we been in class today. This is the note sheet that you would have written. So you would write that asexual reproduction has a full set of genetic information that is exactly the same as the parent. Okay? In sexual reproduction, each have half their genetic information, so the egg and the sperm have half. They put those together to create a fertilized egg, which gives that egg a full set of genetic information, and they are unique or different. In asexual reproduction, that one cell divides to form two offspring that are the same genetic information as the parent. Okay? They are genetically identical. Now, some of you will say, well, what about twins? Okay? Well, in the case of twins, when we're talking about sexual reproduction, it's still fraternal twins, just there were two eggs released at the same time and both eggs were fertilized, so they develop in the womb at the same time. So in sexual reproduction, it still follows the rules of two cells come together to form one offspring. So the egg and the sperm come together to create one offspring that is genetically unique. Now, I will get some who will say, well, what about identical twins? And that is the one exception to the rule, because what happens there is the egg and the sperm come together, and once they come together to the fertilized egg, we don't necessarily understand why this happens, but that fertilized egg divides into two cells and becomes two individual people. So when in sexual reproduction, identical twins is one exception to the rule. So if you're talking about fraternal twins, though, where they're not identical, so there may be a boy and a girl, or they don't look identical, they just happen to be that two eggs were released at the same time. Those two were fertilized by two different sperm, and they developed in the womb at the same time. One of my favorite bad science jokes is that fraternal twins are really just womb mates. You can groan at that. So another thing we need to keep straight, again, and this is notes we would have taken, is human cell division. When mitosis is what's happening, it's creating body cells like skin cells, muscle cells, nerve cells, and there are 46 chromosomes in each of those cells in 23 pairs. In meiosis, that's when you create the sex cells, the sperm and the egg cells, and each cell has 23 chromosomes, or half the genetic information, so that when you come together, you get a full set of genetic information. I know that this brings up lots and lots of questions during this unit, and I'm really sad that I'm not there today to just answer those. So what I'd like you to do is, as you're thinking about this today, or as you're answering, or as you're finishing up, write down the questions that you have, and I will answer them tomorrow during class. This is one of my favorite days. It usually takes us the whole hour to get through this lesson just because of the questions that come in. So I hope that if you had them, you were asking them, writing them down, and I will make sure you finish your Ed puzzle, so watch all the way to the end, and then I will see you guys tomorrow. Have a great day.